Hello everyone and welcome to this lecture. Now is the time to learn how to cache the data that we receive from the server and how to show that cached data if our device is out of internet access. So, if you open Instagram or some similar app, it will show you some content even if you don't have internet connection, because it will just show the data that was stored when you had internet connection. So what happens here is, if we click on load pictures, you can see this loading shimmering effect of the items from the server. Once real data comes in, that effect will disappear. And the most interesting part in here is that if we close our application and if we turn off internet connection and we now reopen our app and click load pictures again, you can see that the data immediately showed up because now it is retrieved from the cache. So the most important thing here is that we are going to build this application in a very professional way. So we will basically use this diagram. We will be using MVVM pattern as well as repository pattern when it comes to our data access. We will use Room for our local SQLite database. Room is basically wrapper over SQLite database, and it is replacement for SQLite helper that we have been using in our older lectures. So you'll see how to use Room database in a modern way. We will have separation of concerns in our code so that it looks clean, and later, if you want to expand functionalities of our app, it will be quite easy to do that because our app will be structured in a very good way. So let's open Android Studio and create new project. So we'll choose empty activity and we can name our app caching app, and we will click on finish. Okay, so now we are ready to start. So API that we will be using for our app is basically from this site in here, and specific endpoint that we will be using for fetching our images will be this one in here. So straight away we can go in our project, we can create a new package, we can name it API, we will create a new class which will be called API constants, and here we will set private string which will be final as well. So we will make constant base URL, and as a base URL we're gonna need this, but without list part, because we will put that later from our retrofit client. So now when I mentioned retrofit, we'll need to add dependency for it because we will be using it for fetching data from the server. I will now paste dependencies that I have copied previously. You can retype it if you want. So we'll use JSON as converter so that we can map those objects that come from the backend to our own objects in the app that will be used. We'll click on sync now. Okay, so synchronization is finished. Actually, we need to make this one public static so that we can use it in other classes as well. Next, we are going to create retrofit client. Retrofit client class we'll hold private static final retrofit. So we'll have instance of retrofit in here so that we can use it later for our API requests. We will create it by using retrofit builder. Base URL will be one that we have just declared. Now for the converter factory, we will use JSON that we have specified in our Gradle file. So we will say let's just a little bit format this code so it's more easier to read. So we'll say JSON converter factory dot create, and we'll just say dot build. So this is the code necessary for creating our retrofit object. And now we will add one public method called getInstance so that we can get retrofit object anywhere we want. So what we also want to do here is to forbid creation of this object, because we don't need it actually. We only need instance of this retrofit, which we want to be a single through entire app. So we'll add private constructor of our retrofit client class. Okay, so we'll leave it in here. And now what we have achieved is that no one can create object of this class, and everyone who calls getInstance will get this same retrofit instance that we have created basically when this class got loaded. So in Java there is class loader which will load this class when the time comes, and once this class gets loaded, those fields will be instantiated, will be basically generated. In our case, since we added some logic in here, this part of code will be executed once this class gets loaded, and later whoever calls getInstance on this class will get this same retrofit instance. So that's why we call it singleton. It's done like that because we don't want to use multiple retrofit objects in this project. Firstly, because we don't need it. We want all retrofit instances to use this converter factory, and we want to save up on our memory and loading time, let's say. So now what we're going to do next is to define interface, or basically API endpoint, which will be hit when we want to get our items. So for that we will create a new package. It will be called DAO, which means data access object. So it's basically something that we are using for the interaction with the server when we want to get the object. So that's why it's called data access in the first place. So we will define interface, which will be called pictures item DAO. In here we want to say that we want to aim get endpoint. If we open back our web browser and click on this endpoint, you can see that we are getting this as a response. We will come back this later to this. Now we need to add list, because if you remember, we have only specified base URL in our constants, and in here we will need to add list. So no slash is required since we got one in here. Now we will say call. So we need a list of some items, and those items are the ones when we click on this. So we can see that the API call returns us a list, which we can tell by this square bracket in here, and objects inside. So in here we can see what that object contains. It contains download URL, which is actually image that we want to display in our app. we see author and ID with height and similar, but currently we are only interested in ID, author, and download URL. So we will create our data transfer object with only 3 fields. So now we have new termin, which is DTO. We'll create new package. So data transfer object, it's called like that because what are those objects used for is only to transfer the data, nothing else. It's basically, let's say, image of the object on the backend. So there is no logic, there is nothing. We just want to fetch the fields from the backend, and later you will see what are we going to do in our app with. So we will create picture item DTO so that we know it's data transfer object. Now to get ID, we need to say serial name ID. In here we can tell that ID is a string, so we will say private string ID. Those two doesn't need to match actually, so you can name this however you want, but this string in here must be the same as one on the backend. So next thing is author. Okay, it's also a string. And the last one is download URL. We can call this one image URL. This is the one. Okay, so we will now generate getters and setters. Now we can go back to our data access object, and we can here put our data transfer object in the list, because we will be getting a list of those objects from the backend. We can name this method get picture items. So we have finished with creating our data access object and with our data transfer object. Now we need to create something that can provide data access object to us, because later we need to call get picture items somehow. So for that purpose, we will create new package. We will name it remote server, and inside it we can create class let's call it remote data access. So what we want from this class is to provide us data access objects. In this case, since we only have our picture item data access object, we will create method called get pictures item DAO, and it will return pictures item DAO. So how it will work, it will basically say retrofit client.getInstance.create pictures items DAO.class, and we'll just return this. So later when somebody calls this, it will have access to this method basically. So now is a question how to create. So how will someone create this, how will someone create object of this class actually. So we will want to make this class singleton as well, because there is no need to have multiple of those. To make that, we firstly need to say private remote data access, so that no one can create object of this class, right? Because private constructor will forbid that. Now we'll say private static final remote data access. We'll say instance. So we have created the instance of remote data access, and now we must provide public method so that someone can actually get this instance. So on the internet, you can probably see, if you ever type in how to create singleton or something like that, you'll probably see something like if instance is equal null, then create basically new instance, and then simply return that instance. But they make feel like this. So this approach is not a thread safe approach, which means that if multiple threads call get instance in the same time, what happens basically is that we will end up with multiple remote data access objects anyway. So if you want to make this singleton thread safe, do it in this way. So basically, in this way, when class loader loads remote data access class, it will automatically create one single object of this type. Since class loader is actually synchronized, we will not end up with multiple instances. There are two or more maybe ways to create singleton instance in a proper thread safe way, but we might tackle that in some other lectures. For now, it's enough to use it in this fashion. So now what we can do, we can simply test it out if we will get the data from backend or not. Of course, we won't do this for main activity later, but for testing purpose, we will just fire API request from here. So what we need to do is to say remote data access, get instance, get pictures item DAO, get picture items. So we'll store it in call object. So you know that we need to get picture items data transfer object actually. So now we'll say call enqueue here. We will add short logs. To just see if we are having something returned in response or if we have some exception thrown. Now we need internet permission. And let's run the app and see the result. So in Locket we must type in our tag and wait for it. Okay, so it says that it's unable to resolve host because internet connection was off. So what we need to do is to turn the internet again. We don't need to rerun app from Android Studio again. We can simply open it. And we can see that we are having items returned from the backend. So So that's for this lecture, and we are continuing on in the next one.